Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 1 in Biology 107. Here we're going to talk about exploring biology, and I want to introduce you to the properties of life and basic concepts in biology. I'm Sage Fernetovich, your instructor, so here we go. The chapter in the Hufnagel's textbook is organized with an overview of what is life and what is biology to start out. We'll talk about the properties of life in that. I'll further talk about the cell theory embedded in one of those. It's an important idea in biology. And we'll also discuss evolution and natural selection and the scientific method. So the first thing that we like to think about in general biology is what it means to be alive. How do we know something is alive? There are many things around us that are questionable, but what are the properties of life? What are we looking for? And there are 5 key properties of life. Life is organized. Life requires energy. Life maintains internal constancy or homeostasis. Life reproduces and develops, and life evolves. I put capital letters at the start of each of the most important words here. So organized, energy, internal constancy, reproduces, develops, and evolves. Those are key ideas here. And I'm going to go through each one to give you some examples and explain it. So the first idea is that life is organized, and life is organized with a basic unit of the cell. The cell is the smallest, most basic unit of life, and the familiar organisms around us, the familiar living things, are multicellular, made of many cells. There are some cells, many cells actually, that are independent and single-celled organisms, things like bacteria. There are some single-celled fungi out there as well, and so we'll talk about those as we get into this topic. Living things and non-living objects do share some commonalities. They both have the same chemical elements, as we'll get into in Chapter 2. We can find carbon in our bodies, and we can find carbon in a rock. And we also follow the same physical and chemical laws. Living things are subject to gravity, as are non-living items. As you'll see in Chapter 1, though, the cell is the smallest, most basic unit of life, but there are levels to biological organization. So the cell in multicellular organisms combines with other similar cells to form tissues. Tissues combine and work together to form organs, which make up organ systems, which makes up organisms. And then we have populations, communities, ecosystems, and the biosphere on top of that. So we have a lot of diversity because of all those levels of interaction with cells and because of evolution, which we will discuss. So the cell is the basic unit of life, of living things, and the cell theory is the foundation of biology. It says that all living things are made of cells. So far, we haven't found anything that is living that is not a cell. And cells come from pre-existing cells. Okay. This is a picture of a human egg cell and sperm cells trying to fertilize it. So cells all come from pre-existing cells. We all start as an egg cell, and our cells multiply through the process of mitosis until we have thousands and millions and eventually trillions of cells making up our body. The second concept or property of life is that life requires energy. Energy is cycled throughout living things over and over again, and our energy comes to us on the earth from the sun. So that is where we can source back all of the energy that's around us to solar energy. Plants harness that energy in photosynthesis, creating sugars, and we'll talk all about that later in this semester. The sugars help to feed the plant and feed herbivores, those animals that will eat the plant. Carnivores can eat the herbivores, and we can have entire food webs and food chains, which really have to do with energy, how we get energy, how it cycles through all of these different types of organisms. So organisms need an input of energy, and they release energy as well. We eat food to get our energy. That's called being heterotrophic. Plants make their own food from sunlight, and that's called autotrophic. It sure would be cool if we could do that. But actually, I really like all the different types of food out there. The third property of life is that life maintains internal constancy or homeostasis. Our bodies have many, many different variables going on inside them. So we have temperature, we have water content, we have salt content, we have locations of our organs, and everything is maintained within a set level of factors. So another name for this is homeostasis. And this picture is showing the homeostasis being achieved through panting. So as the dog gets hot, dogs actually don't sweat. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they pant to regulate their temperature. And so the water evaporates off their tongues and it cools their body. We sweat, the sweat evaporating cools us. We shiver, and our hair stands up on our body to maintain that level of homeostasis in terms of body temperature. Our blood has a very fascinating way of maintaining pH within certain bounds. And we will discuss that when we get into chapter 2 when we talk about what pH is. Now, this is a clip art picture of maybe the most adorable child on the planet. I don't know, but I couldn't resist putting this one in. Life reproduces and develops. Now, not all individual living things reproduce. We certainly know people who don't have children, but as populations reproduce. And when individuals reproduce, the offspring develops. We even see this at the cellular level. Cells duplicate themselves. Okay, they make copies of themselves, and those cells start out as baby cells. They're smaller and less developed than more mature cells. So cells reproduce and develop. People reproduce and develop generally. Plants go through their own process of sexual or asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is when there are two different gametes involved in the reproduction, like sperm and egg. Asexual reproduction is when there aren't two sets of gametes and one organism can reproduce itself, kind of like cloning. The last property of life is that life evolves. And evolution is an important idea in biology. It explains why we have such diversity on the planet. It also explains why we have connections and unity in life. And evolution is a change in population over time. Okay, so a population is a group of organisms of the same species in a given area. Okay, so people in the United States, we are a population. People on the planet Earth, population. You can change the magnitude of the place, but it's all the same species. Okay, in a given area. We could even get smaller. We could say a population of people in Holyoke or in the classroom. Over time, populations change. Populations change. This isn't individual development, but it's the change in a population. So a simple example is if we look back 200 years ago, people were shorter. Through nutrition, our average height has gotten taller. That's an example of population change over time. The mechanism that is most common for evolution is natural selection. This is proposed by Charles Darwin in the 1800s, but it's not the only way that evolution can occur. It's the most common way that evolution occurs out in the natural world. On farms and in domesticated scenarios, we have artificial selection. And mutations can also play a role in this. So natural selection involves a couple assumptions that traits are heritable. That is, that they can be passed down from parent to offspring. You inherit certain characteristics, and that characteristics or traits are variable. They change. Like we inherit hair color from our parents, but there's variation. One parent might have red hair, one might have brown hair. So there's variation there. And then what you get, you inherit kind of a combination of the genes from your parents. In a particular environment, certain traits or certain variations of traits help an individual to survive. So some traits are beneficial, some are not as beneficial. And the organisms with the beneficial traits will go on, reproduce more offspring, and pass on those beneficial traits. Now, hair color isn't a great example of something that's evolutionarily beneficial, but there are plenty of examples out there. So this is a very simple illustration showing how variation, right here, these different colored dots, can lead to a population change or evolution. So in this scenario, unfavorable mutations select against the light colored dot. So they maybe get eaten by a predator, or they have some sort of mutation that is unfavorable to reproduction. And so these darker dots can make copies of themselves. There's a little variation there. Not exact clones, but the lighter ones again, not favorable. And so we end up with a population that's different than the original population. That is a very simple thing, very simple way to express evolution. So evolution leads to changes in populations. It can also lead to a new species. And that's called speciation. So I'd like you to think about what a species is, and I am going to do a part 2 video finishing up this idea and finishing up chapter 1.